Good morning and welcome to the Justice Committee's 29th meeting of 2018. We have apologies for Jenny Gilruth and we welcome back George Adam to attend as substitute. Our first item on the agenda is consideration as to whether to take our consideration of a draft report on post-legislative scrutiny on the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act 2012 and the draft report on Brexit and the civil and criminal justice systems and policing in Scotland in private today and at future meetings. Are we all agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Agenda item 2 is an evidence session on post-legislative scrutiny of the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act 2012. I refer members to paper 1, which is note by the clerk, and paper 2, which is a private paper. Our final scheduled evidence session is with Humza Yousaf, Cabinet Secretary for Justice, Ash Denham, Minister for Community Safety, who are accompanied by their officials. And I welcome the Cabinet Secretary back to the committee, and also the Minister who is making her first appearance before us in her new role. Both the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister have indicated they wish to make a short opening statement, up to about a minute and a half each. And Cabinet Secretary, do you want to begin?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the committee. It is a pleasure to be in front of you, and can I thank the committee for the opportunity to be here, but also for the very thorough and extensive evidence sessions that you have taken on this important issue. I'm assured that while a number of issues along this journey have been highlighted, that the need for reform and the principles of the 2012 Act have been very much widely accepted. Police and fire reform is one of the most significant public sector reforms since devolution. As members will know, reform is not just about fiscal necessity and improved efficiency, but also which was prompted by unprecedented pressures on budget. We also, of course, aimed to improve services, improve outcomes by creating more equal access to specialist support, and of course strengthening the connection between services and their local communities. I believe that reform has been successful so far, and that there's evidence of these three key aims taking effect in both sectors. This contrasts, I should say, with the position in England and Wales, where the Home Affairs Committee recently published a report that found, and I quote, that the current structure is a significant barrier to the service's ability to tackle national and transnational threats. Now, I accept that it's not always been a smooth ride. It would be foolish to suggest otherwise. Reform on this scale really is. However, lessons from the first 5 years are very much being learned. Susan Deacon has overseen significant improvements within the Scottish Police Authority, and there's now a strong leadership team with Police Scotland led by the new Chief Constable, Ian Livingston. Policing 2026 has created a framework to allow transformation to bed in following reform, creating a service that is responsive to the challenges of modern policing. I'm aware, Convener, of the very short time that I have for an opening statement, so I think I will leave it there and say that I look forward to questions from the committee, but I'm very confident that reform has been successful, but also, of course, clearly need to ensure that we learn lessons from the past to inform better practice in the future.
Minister.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the committee, and also pleased to be here to discuss this legislation this morning. So the Police and Fire Reform Act created two very different organisations, and the Fire and Rescue Framework for Scotland 2016 sets out Scottish ministers' expectations of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Audit Scotland's 2015 review of fire reform concluded that the Scottish Government and SFRS had managed the merger of the 8 fire and rescue services effectively. Audit Scotland also concluded that the performance of SFRS is improving, and the move from 8 local services to a national organisation had enhanced the scrutiny and challenge of the SFRS. Her Majesty's Fire Service Inspectorate also confirmed that SFRS is operationally effective. And I am pleased to note that the majority of submissions to the committee on fire have acknowledged, either explicitly or tacitly, that the policy intentions of the Act in relation to fire reform are being met. Looking forward, SFRS transformation proposals are focused on the service delivering more for the communities of Scotland. And finally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the brave firefighters and the staff within the service who we know work tirelessly to keep us all safe.
Okay, thank both Cabinet Secretary and the Minister for these opening statements. I move now to questions. Rona.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Can I just probe a wee bit further on the case for reform? And if I could sort of ask you what the implications might have been had reform not taken place and we'd remained with the legacy.
I thank Rona Mackay for the question. I'm going to try not to do this too often, but I think it is helpful that if we look at the financial constraints we all know that we've been under in the last decade, the austerity agenda, the pressure on budgets, you would just have to look at what is happening, for example, in other parts of the United Kingdom to see what potentially could have happened here. So in Scotland, you know, since we've inherited, since we were in administration, the number of police officers that we inherited, we vastly increased. That number significantly increased. That number of police officers. In the same term, we've seen an almost 14% reduction in officers in England and Wales. And I just read that Home Affairs Select Committee quote, which I think was quite pertinent, which talked about the need for looking at the structure and looking at reform. So there would have been undoubtedly a huge financial burden, which would have led to very, very difficult choices, which ultimately would have had impacts on policing at a local level in the communities that we all represent as MSPs. So that would have been certainly part of it. I think the other part is not just the impact of what would have happened if we hadn't made the reform that we did, but actually looking at what improvements in the service have been made since reform. And I thought you had some very good evidence from a number of third sector organisations, but I was particularly taken by what was said by Rape Crisis Scotland around how they thought, and I paraphrase slightly, but how they said that there would be a really transformative shift in how rape cases were investigated and approached by the police with police reform, in comparison to the previous structure. So there's no doubt at all that without reform we would have faced huge financial pressures, and we still face those financial pressures, and we can discuss some of them, I've no doubt, in the session. But we would have faced really difficult decisions that would have had to be made about police numbers and so on and so forth. But also, no doubt that we wouldn't have the specialists and capabilities that we have to the extent that we have if we hadn't gone ahead with reform. So I think in those areas, if nothing else, then we've been absolutely successful. And look, some of that is also borne out, this is the finally bit, is by the fact that our approach to certain specialities is also now being viewed by other countries and other parts of the UK. And I think that's a great testament to the reform.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you. I think without reform, the fire services in general in Scotland would have been in quite a different position, although obviously it's a counterfactual, it's quite difficult to say for sure. But whilst delivering the aims of reform, obviously there have been no station closures and no compulsory redundancies, which I think is you know, in a challenging financial environment, you know, is something to be said for that. And also, to echo what the Cabinet Secretary said about specialist resources, there has been now much more equitable a spread of access to resources across Scotland than there was under the regional system. So the objectives of reform have been met. So, you know, to protect and improve local services, there's equal access across Scotland to resources, and also to strengthen that connection as well between the service and also local communities. We can see that coming through very strongly. Overall resilience across Scotland has improved very much. The National Service is able to respond to incidents across the country in a way that legacy forces just weren't able to do. And we can see that coming out if we look at things like the response that was taken to Storm Frank. So there was a number of incidents across the country, and the service was able to flex response to address those, but also to maintain cover across Scotland, which obviously wouldn't have been as easy to do under the legacy system. And also with major incidents such as the Glasgow School of Art fire as well, you know, taking numbers and numbers of appliances, you know, crews, staff, a huge response like that, but also still maintaining the coverage across Scotland as well. So I think without reform, national resilience and outcomes may have been affected.
Thank you. And if I could just ask, the Cabinet Secretary said that talked about some of the positive evidence, and we have heard largely positive evidence. But as you say, it was a huge undertaking. And was the size and complexity of what was about to happen fully understood, do you think, at the outset?
Yes, everybody benefits from hindsight. I don't doubt that for a second. And obviously, in my position, this predates my own role as Cabinet Secretary for Justice. But I haven't heard anything from my predecessor that has suggested that this was going to be an easy task, that, or even his predecessor, that this was somehow going to be a walk in the park by any stretch of imagination. One of the biggest pieces of reform undertaken since devolution, there was always going to be challenges, and that's why the scrutiny that you have done as a committee has been so welcomed. I think you're right, the submissions we've had have been largely constructive and positive, but clearly from stakeholders there's also some concerns, anxieties and questions being asked, and I think as a government we look forward to hearing the conclusion of your evidence sessions, the report that you'll produce, and where there are lessons that can be learnt in the immediate term, then we should look towards that. Where there are perhaps longer term issues for us to look at, then of course we should take a long-term view of that. But no, I don't think it was underestimated by any stretch. I think those that were involved in this endeavour understood that it would be a huge task, and that didn't doubt for a second that this reform was necessary, but undoubtedly that it would certainly throw up more than one or two issues.
Okay, thank you.
Liam Kerr, supplementary.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Just very briefly, we talked about the policy intentions. I think Police Scotland is projected to be about 35 million in debt this year, and I see the papers reporting today there could be another 15 million to go on top of that. So has that policy intention been achieved?
We're trying to look at the case for the reform at this thing.
I'm happy to answer that.
We'll answer that.
Why is that not policy intention?
Yeah, I suppose it is.
Well, I would make the point to Liam Kerr, of course, it would be helped if we had that 175 million VAT over the period of reform that is required, that was taken off both fire and Police Scotland. That would have helped our finances fairly significantly. What I would say in terms of the deficit itself, Police Scotland, and SPA I should say, their projections are that they will overreach in terms, they will do better than what was expected of them in terms of financial savings. 1.1 billion, they believe that they'll be able to accumulate 1.9 billion pounds worth of savings. Now, when it comes to the deficit, they've got a plan to reduce that deficit and tackle that deficit by 2021. Now, clearly there's some uncertainties around some of that, Brexit being the biggest one. What that will mean for police officer numbers, what that would mean then for deficit reduction and so on and so forth, are obviously still in the air, while that issue is still, the uncertainty around that issue is still plaguing us. But the savings target attached to reform, that 1.1 billion, has not just been expected to be met, but will be expected to be exceeded. So, the deficit issue, of course, is one that we have to continually keep an eye on, right, that we scrutinise. But I would say to the member that those savings, I think, are a real positive.
There will be a bit of overlap between our areas. We're trying to cover themes very, very thoroughly between reform and policy intentions, so members can judge it for themselves. Liam MacArthur.
Good morning, panel. Just sticking on that theme, I mean, clearly we can all learn with hindsight, but I think the evidence we've heard from a number of sources. I asked the Chief Superintendent, Ivor Marshall, who appeared for us on behalf of the Association of Police Superintendents, about this specific issue as to whether the complexity had been underestimated, and he was absolutely in no doubt that it had. He said the consequences of that were that we have run a structural deficit for 5 years because the transformation has not generated the income, so we have needed to take a patch-up and make-do approach to the budget. So there were real consequences of that, and I hear what you're saying about the projections of managing that budget deficit down over future years. But we were getting those assurances back in 2012, 2013, that the financial position would be sound, and that was on the understanding that the VAT issue that you raised earlier, the UK government's position on that had again been made clear. So if that was being factored in, then that seems to be a high-risk strategy in terms of setting the foundations for the new police service, is it not?
Look, in some respects, it's somewhat difficult for me to go back to a time that predates my role as Cabinet Secretary for Justice. Say, what were the innermost thoughts of various people within government, within police structures, around whether they overestimated, underestimated any of the challenges and complexities ahead. I've never had that impression, I must say, particularly from my predecessor, that reform would be anything other than a challenging task, but very much a necessary task. What I would say around the structural deficit is the SPA have a plan in place to get that deficit down. They will, of course, be judged upon that plan. I do put a caveat in there, which I know SPA also put in there, that there is some uncertainty around Brexit and what that will mean for the deficit reduction, of course. We will wait to see. But I go back to that central point I made. The reform targets for saving were 1.1 billion. SPA project they will exceed that target, 1.9 billion. I think that is something that we can't just dismiss. I think that's very positive. Did it take us, did it take SPA, did it take us longer to get there? No, actually, we should get those savings, we think, earlier than projected also. So I think we're in a good place. That is not to say that when it comes to any portfolio, including my own, there aren't budgets that we have to balance going into a financial year, some underspends, overspends that we have to do. And I'm keeping a close eye, certainly, on that budget deficit. And the SPA know very well that you and, of course, the subcommittee are also keeping a close eye on that. But there is a plan to deal with it.
I mean, I appreciate that as you say, you can't second guess the thoughts not just of your predecessor, but his predecessor in turn. But I think it's safe to say that the assurances that were being given around the financial position about the savings that would be made were made in part to reassure the Parliament, who saw those savings as absolutely pivotal in allowing the police force in particular, but also fire and rescue service, to deliver against the legislation. I think the concern is that the assurances we're being given at the moment about budget savings are similarly being offered up in an attempt to reassure. And I think what we need as a committee to understand is how solid the basis for those assurances are compared to what happened last time. You've mentioned on a couple of occasions now the threat of Brexit. I think the issue that seems to rear up most specifically in terms of determining whether those future savings can be made and the structural deficit brought down is the investment in ICT. We've had Professor Nick Fife saying as much. HMICS have said it. Police Scotland themselves have acknowledged it. A sizable investment in ICT, which is the only way of unlocking a large proportion of those savings. So is there an assurance that you can give the committee that you've heard what Police Scotland are saying and will be responding positively to that case?
I can absolutely give an assurance that I've listened to Police Scotland. They've presented their wishes, their desires around their ICT system, of course, which have had a public hearing, as you know, as well. I don't doubt the need to reform, to invest in that technology. I think all of us that have interacted with the police, as every member of the Justice Committee here will have done, will have heard those pleas from the police. It's important that lessons are learnt from, of course, I6, again, something the committee will have looked at in detail previously. The robustness of the investment being asked for from SPA, from Police Scotland around ICT is now something that we will look to see if we can verify the numbers, the figures, make sure we test that to the nth degree. You would expect us to do that. But clearly when it comes to budget negotiations, I know Liam MacArthur won't expect me to prejudge those discussions. I am, as every Cabinet Secretary is in those budget discussions with the Finance Secretary, and there's no doubt at all that he and I both, of course, keep a close eye and listen closely to what the Chief Constable and indeed the Chair of SPA have to say. I should say, it will be important for us to make sure because of previous experiences, that we absolutely just test the veracity of those figures. You would expect no less of me as a Cabinet Secretary to do, but the principle of the case around ICT investment I think is extremely difficult to argue against.
I certainly welcome the assurance you give around the challenge function to whatever it is that Police Scotland come forward with in relation to ICT. I think learning lessons, I think I6 would perhaps be one of the most obvious of those. But if you were to find that the proposal being put forward by Police Scotland in relation to their ICT ambitions do not match up, then presumably you need to make an assessment as to the implications that has for bringing down the structural deficit within the service.
Well, it's one of the issues around the structural deficit is investment in ICT, and as you say, unlocking that. But you know, it's just worth saying that the deficit reduction plans up until 2021 are not fully dependent on ICT investment. There is an element of that. I absolutely accept that. But you know, bear in mind that the ICT investment plan is over a much longer timescale than, for example, the deficit reduction plan that SPA currently have in place. So, although it's a part of it, and I accept fully what Liam MacArthur is saying, he's right in that. But you know, it is not the only place where you know, efficiencies can be found, can be made, and can be unlocked. But his point is not lost to me.
We are kind of flexible today. We're seeing where we go with questions. On that point, Cabinet Secretary, HMICS has stated in its written submission that the full benefits of police reform will not be evidenced until the national ICT system are in place. So it's not just SPA, it's not just a wish, you know, from the Cabinet, from the Chief Constable. It's pretty fundamental. Could you comment on that?
I have a huge amount of respect for the Inspectorate. I value what Jill Emery has to say, and I hold a lot of value in the words that she says. So I'm not here to argue with that. I hope I've demonstrated my answer to Liam MacArthur that any of us that have interacted with the police will understand and believe absolutely that there is a need to invest in ICT. What I'm saying is you would expect, I'm sure, as others would expect, the public would expect me to, of course, make sure that those figures are absolutely robust. And Police Scotland, I have to say, when I mention that to them, I absolutely welcome that robust challenge to the figures, to the detail of the case. And then, of course, there's a conversation for me to have with the Finance Secretary around unlocking potentially some of the money in around that. And that is a conversation that is taking place, of course. It is part of budget negotiations. But the Finance Secretary also, of course, as you would understand, would want those that case rigorously challenged to ensure that you know, we do not get ourselves into a situation where perhaps we are having to commit more money, to find more money for a project that is valuable, of course, but that could be costing more to the public purse than it possibly should be.
Shona.
Morning.
I want to come back to national resilience in a moment, but given we're talking about the ICT system, obviously the UK government has now accepted the principle around VAT, as you outlined in your initial comments. Presumably, having accepted the principle of that, if there was a backdating of VAT to when this issue was first raised, would that be a substantial contribution to the ICT project, and is that being pursued?
It's always being pursued for absolutely sure, but it would make a substantial difference to investment in the police, including, of course, into ICT, if we got that well, 175 million between the two organisations, the vast majority of that for police. So yes, if they conceded that there was an argument around Police Scotland being able to reclaim 25 million of VAT, then if you agree with the principle, then surely you should agree with the principle since reform took place. Now, have to say I'm not holding my breath to see any movement from the UK government on that. But if they were to produce and to act equitably and fairly on this issue, then yes, I mean the asks of the ICT ask from Police Scotland is in and around the kind of 300 million mark, or just shy of that. The VAT would perhaps go a fair way in helping with that investment.
Okay. Go back to national resilience. I think without a doubt the evidence has been very strong that if you're to hold up what has been the biggest success of reform has been without a doubt the ability, which of course is one of the three pillars, the ability of both services to respond with more equal access. And if you think about some of the big challenges that have faced the services, whether it's the Art School fire or significant storms, then I think that has been proven. I guess my question would be, what further scope is there to enhance and build that national resilience in other areas? And if you look at the third pillar around the need to strengthen the connection between services and communities, is it fair to say that while continuing to focus and improve on national resilience, the effort and focus has been, particularly over the last few months, has shifted to strengthening that local connection? I think the evidence that we've all heard has pointed to perhaps initially that not being the strongest outcome of reform, but that over the last few months we've seen significant progress. A number of local authorities have given evidence, which I'm sure you've seen, to suggest that there has now been a marked improvement in those local connections. Where there may be scope to go further is around issues around budgets and having more devolved budgeting and control over those budgets. So it would be useful just to hear over the next period of time, both in national resilience and that local connectedness, what are the key objectives of the continuing reform you would like to see?
To try to do both questions in the order that they came. In terms of the national resilience piece, I agree with John Robinson's assessment, and also the assessment of a number of third sector organisations in particular, that there has been dramatic improvement in many areas of police investigation and police approach to a number of issues. Again, Rape Crisis Scotland, Scottish Women's Aid as well. I thought their evidence particularly compelling on that front. I think where Police Scotland will look to continue to improve and strengthen it, is probably the better word, strengthen that national resilience, will be in around some of those challenges that we face around cyber security and cyber resilience. They'll continue to do the work they're doing on child protection and human trafficking as well, but also of course the terror threat, which again, if you look over the last 12 months in the UK, we know that that challenge can take many different forms. So there's no doubt that. There is then looking at what they've done in and around the area of sexual offences and domestic abuse, which again you heard compelling evidence around, and seeing how can lessons be learned from how they've managed to strengthen that capability. Can that be rolled out across other parts of the service as well? I thought the evidence from the Chief Constable was incredibly stark. I thought the statistic that he used, in his words, I think it was that 320 murders have been committed since Police Scotland was formed, and all but 2 of them had been detected. All but 2 of them. I think the 2 that involved, I think he said, were undetected were in relation to serious organised crime. And I should say that is the other capability which I know Police Scotland, from a national perspective, are looking to strengthen, is their approach and their investigation and their disrupting of serious organised crime as well. In terms of the second part of our question, which I imagine will be a fair part of your evidence, was a fair part of your evidence gathering session around the local issues. Again, I thought the evidence from local authorities was challenging. in some respects. I think they were quite frank in saying that in the first kind of years of reform, it hadn't worked to their expectations. But I definitely detected from the evidence sessions that many of them were saying that they are in a much better and much improved situation. I'm also heartened by the Chief Constable's words on this. Again, I'm paraphrasing, not directly quoting, but you know, the Chief Constable has said on many occasions that he is very keen to see how they can further devolve aspects of policing to local authorities and local communities ultimately as well. Some of that we are looking at how we strengthen from a national perspective. I heard again evidence from local authorities suggesting that you know the Scottish Government in some aspects need to be involved in some of that local conversation a bit more. We have the Convener Scrutiny Forum that involves the Scottish Government at official level as well, which meets a couple of times a year. I think that helps to add to that. There is, of course, statutory obligations on both the police, but also actually in government when it comes to policing, about engaging with and consulting with local authorities. But I have to say, out of all the evidence sessions that you've taken, the evidence session from and the input from local authorities is one that I keep have kept a really close eye on, because I'm very, very keen that if there are improvements to be made, which evidently from the evidence that there are, then we should make those improvements.
Finally, Convener, can I just ask, there are parts of the UK that are looking at some of the evidence and outcomes now that both services are quite far down the line. Are other parts of the UK looking? I know that there's talk about reform elsewhere. Are you aware of?
I mean, just going by the budget, you know, there was mention of reform around the police service by the Chancellor. So, you know, I don't doubt for a second that there's many parts of the UK looking at what we've done here in Scotland. It'd be also fair to say there's been a fair bit of international interest in Police Scotland and the reform process that they've undertaken as well. So that is recognising, I think, with humility, no doubt, that there were challenges, of course, that there were, but you know, not forgetting that you know, one of the key successes of Police Scotland and the reform will be judged by making our community safer. And if I look at the statistics from 2012-13 to now, the Crime and Justice Survey estimates a 13% reduction in recorded crime overall, and that's from reform. So, you know, we've seen some really positive indicators about keeping our community safe, and it's not a surprise to me that other parts of the UK and indeed internationally looking at the achievements of Police Scotland.
Minister, that you haven't had an opportunity to comment on the local scrutiny aspect and any other aspect that was covered in Shona's questions.
Convener. Yes, so I'd just like to add from a fire perspective, I think when we think about fire, we often think about obviously responses to fires, but obviously the Fire and Rescue Service covers so many other aspects, you know, a variety of other incidents that they respond to, and especially things that are, you know, growing, so like climate change. So that could be things like flooding, which obviously we've seen across Scotland quite a lot over the last few years, and the Fire and Rescue Service responds to that. But also equally that can also involve dry weather, which can lead to wildfires, which we saw in the summer. And obviously we saw the great response that the fire service made to those this year. Also things like terrorism as well. So this national resilience, you know, the fact that the National Service has that capability in order to respond to incidents of this type is a very important part of their role. When I was doing visits during the summer, I went to visit Dumfries Station, and that's one of their new specialist water rescue stations. And obviously went out to see a demonstration of the capabilities that they had there, and the officers that were there, you know, they were very clear with me that this, you know, ability to do the water rescue, you know, to have that specialism in Dumfries like that was very important to them, because of the fact they're being required to use it so much locally. So in fact, since they started that in 2017, they've been called out for water rescue 28 times already. So, you know, they're using it an awful lot. But also, they were very pleased, obviously, to be part of that national picture as well. So to have that capability and to be able to respond, not just locally, but also across, you know, the broader picture. But in terms of how the fire service interact with local communities, I think there's some very good evidence that the way that the legislation was set up, and particularly with the local senior officers, the LSOs, that is, you know, it was enshrined in the legislation in 2012. It's working very well. It allows that connection between local communities and that scrutiny with local councillors and so on. And the Audit Scotland report of 2015 had commented on that as well and said that they had very effective local engagement with the move to the National Service. So I hope that gives a flavour from the fire perspective.
Thank you for that. Supplementary, Liam Kerrin, Liam MacArthur.
Just briefly, Cabinet Secretary, to go back to your communities line, the policy intent on communities. I think there are reports this morning that the clear-up rate for burglaries are sitting at around 23.9%. So if that's right, is the Cabinet Secretary really comfortable that the community policy intention has been achieved?
Well, look, when it comes to being comfortable, of course, we'd all want to see our statistics going in a positive direction, a positive trajectory. The question was about local accountability, local governance. What I would say is that many of the statistics, whether it's our recorded crime stats, whether it's a crime and justice survey, the longer term trend, I know people can pick out 1 year trends and you know, it's not, I don't dismiss them, but the longer term trends have seen a positive trend and a positive trajectory when it comes to violent crime, when it comes to well, robberies, for example, over the last decade. So we've seen positive stats. Am I pleased about that statistic that Liam Kerrin? Of course, I'm not comfortable with that statistic, and we'll continue to I'm sure, all of us collectively push Police Scotland to see what further action can be taken to increase the clear-up rates. But the point was around local accountability and local scrutiny. Now, one of the key elements of the Act, of course, is to ensure that whatever Police Scotland produce, the local policing plans have to be in consultation with local authorities. And of course, the statutory requirement for local commanders, of course, helps to inform some of that. Now, if you, in your evidence session, there are gaps that are identified by local authorities in particular, which you think could help to drive up clear-up rates, could help to drive down crime, then of course I have no doubt that Police Scotland, SPA, and of course as a government, we will look closely at that.
Thanks very much. Just clarifying up what I think I heard you say, Cabinet Secretary, in linking the positive trend in terms of reducing crime rates to police reform. I mean, it's true to say that reducing crime rates are a feature across the UK where we haven't seen reform. So I'm struggling to understand why you would make a causal link between the restructuring of Police Scotland and reduction in crime rates.
Well, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I'll go back into my briefing and see whether he's right about there being a reduction in crime rate across the other parts of the UK. I'll double check that if I may, and come back to him. My point that I was making was clearly in some areas, as you've heard evidence from Rape Crisis Scotland, Scottish Women's Aid, there's been a transformative approach to investigation of certain crimes. And we know that there has been, for example, more confidence now in, for example, reporting sexual crimes and so on and so forth. All I was doing simply to give the members some comfort was just giving them the actual numbers on the ground, which are the Scottish Crime and Justice Survey estimates that crime has fallen by 13% since 2012-13. Now, there'll be a variety of factors around that. But I do make the point that, you know, I think we are doing better than other parts of the UK. I think reform is certainly a part of that. Just looking at the statistics in England and Wales, you know, we saw an increase by 11% in terms of recorded crime in 2017. 18. Now, I appreciate there's difference of recording and methods of recording, but that you know, is different to what we saw in Scotland.
With respect, you've just lectured the committee about long-term trends. I mean, I'd be interested to get a figure that is comparative as opposed to plucking a figure out of the air. And I would also caution against attributing reductions in crime rates to structural reform of policing. There's a variety, I think, as you acknowledge, a variety of reasons why crime rates will be down in Scotland. And I think it would be dangerous to attribute police reform or giving too much significance to the restructuring of policing to any figures, whether on an annual basis or on a longer term basis.
I mean, I think it would look at two things. First of all, I never come to the committee to lecture the committee, I should say, ever. That is not the approach I was taking. Is simply suggesting that you know, it's important for. I said in my answer that I'd never dismiss upon your figures. I simply make the point that longer-term trends are what we should look at, and I'll see if I can provide those to Lee MacArthur. But where there's a point of agreement between Lee MacArthur and I, and I don't look to seek any disagreement here, I think the point of agreement is that you know, I'm not suggesting that the reform is the only reason that there's been a reduction in crime that we've seen over the last 5 years since reform. But I think also it would be churlish to ignore the fact that reform has brought some capability, some additionality to that, and has been a part of the downward trajectory that we've seen since reform. And I accept that we're seeing a downward trajectory also before reform, but I certainly think that reform has played a part in that.
Okay. Fulton, then Daniel.
Good morning, panel. It's following on from the line of questioning there from Shona and from Liam MacArthur. Do you think, Cabinet Secretary, there's a consistency across the country in terms of protection and improvement of local services? And I know that you've given some really good national examples. You've talked about them a few times, but is there any local examples you can give? And I know that the Minister referred to a good local example from a fire perspective in Dumfries.
Perspective, what I would say is that when it comes to that national expertise, so we know that there's been a concerted effort to get a more effective response on issues such as terrorism, child protection, major investigations, human trafficking is just some examples. I think almost every single one of us around the table, you know, we will have dealt as MSPs with cases that involve difficult issues around major investigations, child protection issues, and the fact that these are national capabilities that have been strengthened, we shouldn't lose sight that the effects of that are noticed locally. So it is locally that where you will notice the positive effects of that kind of national spatiality, that national capability. So I think on those issues, absolutely. I would say that in terms of meeting local needs, there's an emphasis on this in the 2026 strategy, but also in the 3-year implementation plan that the police have from 2017 to 2020 as well. Worth also saying that national regional expertise also, when I use that phrase, that also includes frontline officers who are deployed in communities across Scotland. So when and as the need arises, they provide additional support to local policing. Also. So I think there's a number of areas where we've seen, as I say, a strengthening of a national capability, but that is being very much felt at a local level. And again, I know I keep going back to what was said by Rape Crisis Scotland and others, but again, you know, that will be felt at a local level. That transformative change, as they described it, a transformative approach, as Rape Crisis Scotland referred to it, will very much be felt at a local level.
I mean, I think a lot of this area has been well covered by both the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister, but just as one follow-up point to that, how do you think we can improve the local scrutiny bodies? We heard quite a lot of evidence from various local authorities in different areas, and the police talking about different areas as well, about how maybe some issues such as missing people, for example, can be, although it's a national issue, it can be more of an issue in some areas as opposed to others. So how do you think we can improve those local scrutiny bodies to make sure that, as you say there, the issues that maybe have more significance or are only significant in a certain area can be highlighted and people brought on board to deal with it?
I mean, I think the COSLA Police Scrutiny Conveners Forum, which brings together the elected members who lead on police scrutiny functions across the 32 local authorities, meets a couple of times a year and includes senior representation from Police Scotland, the SPA, the Scottish Government. I think that is probably the forum by which to have that conversation, because I don't doubt what local authorities say, that you know, certain focuses on national capabilities, you know, there might be a disconnect between that and what they're perceiving on the ground in their particular local authority, and it has to be the forum by which to be able to air that. Now, there are various forums, but this very high senior level forum, in terms of the COSLA's Police Scrutiny Conveners Forum, is probably the place by which to have some of that conversation. But also, you know, I've got no doubt at all, especially to the stakeholders I've spoken to, everybody is looking very closely at the evidence sessions that you've had and the outcomes of that. So, you know, we are happy to see where we can improve, and I'm sure Police Scotland and SPA, from the evidence I've seen, also happy to see where there can be improvements in some of those governance structures. Yes, I think the Police Scrutiny Conveners Forum will be incredibly important in making sure that there's alignment between local and national priorities.
Minister, do you have a comment?
Thank you. Yes, so SFRS similarly, you know, is a national service, but it delivered locally. And there is a need, obviously, to balance that consistency across the country with also, you know, local autonomy where, you know, it's necessary, because that's usually quite beneficial. And I think the legislation does allow for that balance to be struck there. There is that leeway there for local priorities to come through. And certainly with the LSOs, as I mentioned in my previous answer, obviously to develop tailored local plans, you know, in conjunction with all the local partners, with local communities, in order to meet the needs of the local communities. And as a direct consequence of how the National Service is working, I think most people would agree that local elected members are now having a much more interaction with the service than ever before. And I think there's this coming through very much more that it's you know, is clear, it is accountable, but there is leeway there, I think, for the LSOs to develop more and to respond directly to local priorities.
Okay, thank you. Daniel.
Good morning. Can I begin by just picking up both the comment you made in your opening remarks and First Letter. In the opening remarks you said you've no doubt that there are a number of lessons learned, and a number of occasions you've also said that we could all benefit from hindsight. I was just wondering if you could just maybe bring to life what the key issues that you think we would have benefited from hindsight, and what the consequences might have been in terms of the things that we might have wanted to avoid if we had had that hindsight at the outset.
Well, I would say I'm always happier looking forward than I am looking back, but it is important to do so, and the purpose of this evidence session and the evidence sessions you've taken, of course, is to learn some of those lessons. I think there's no doubt at all that issues around local scrutiny and governance and alignment has been a key theme, and I think, you know, again, looking back over the years, could some of those structures have been improved for local governance and scrutiny? So where the Act will have a statutory requirement, how does that actually practically, how is that practically given effect? So for me, the local issue in hindsight, for sure. I think when I look at other issues as well, on the national capability, I think it's, you know, again, lessons to be learned from politicians, you know, government, SPA and Police Scotland. I've no doubt it's taken a bit of time to, of course, be comfortable with each of the roles and responsibilities that those institutions and organisations have. Though, you know, I don't doubt we're in a much better place now that, you know, we'll look back and say, well, could some of this, some of the difficulties and the challenges we faced, could that have been avoided potentially? I've got no doubt in that, in fact, as well. But for me, you know, the particular lessons, I think, what I'm hearing loud and clear is in and around the local priorities, the local governance, the local scrutiny, and ensuring that the National Police Service that we have is aligned to some of that.
So just on that local point and following on from colleagues' lines of questioning, I mean, obviously in terms of local division numbers, we've seen a reduction in around over 300 officers from local divisions, and likewise we had very clear evidence from both Callum Steele and Ivor Marshall about the pressures that officers in local divisions feel. Both of them expressed a need for a demand-led review to look at the requirements placed on local divisions and to look at what the resourcing levels might be. Their point being that, in a sense, the numbers are very much inherited from the legacy forces, and the reason and rhyme of why those levels are what they are has well and truly been lost, probably well before reform ever took place. Do you reflect that requirement? Do you think there is a need to have a demand-led review, and would you back their calls?
Look, this is always a difficult position to be in as Cabinet Secretary for Justice, in the sense that, you know, you, I think, and not you personally, but I mean, I imagine the Parliament would be the first to accuse me of being interfering if I was to dictate to the Chief Constable how many should be at national, regional, local level, how many officers should be at those levels. But at the same time, absolutely cannot ignore what local authorities and what other stakeholders that Daniel Johnson has mentioned may well say. I do go back to my point, if I may, to Fulton McGregor, that although there may be officers and a rebalancing of officers, more officers than we've seen in previous years in the national capability, that does have a local impact. And it does have an impact in creating keeping local communities safe and tackling specific issues. I mentioned some of them: child protection, human trafficking, major investigations, at very much a local level. It is not a case of officers sitting in some kind of national ivory tower not doing work at a local level. That's not at all to dismiss his points and other stakeholders' points. In fact, I know Labour's manifesto discussed having Police Scotland having if I remember the quote correctly, it was a balanced workforce, and for the Chief Constable to be given that leverage to create that quote-unquote balanced workforce is going to be incredibly important. I won't say this often, but I agree with that within your manifesto, that I think we have to give the Chief Constable absolutely the space from an operational perspective to do what he thinks is right to get the positive outcomes that is possible. So I'm not in a position, and I won't certainly be demanding that the Chief Constable deploys officers in a certain way. That is very much for him to do.
And just following up some of the previous points, and I don't want to tread on others' toes, but just one specific suggestion that has come up frequently in our evidence sessions is the possibility of giving local scrutiny panels both powers over budget and also the ability to appoint divisional commanders. Do you think those sorts of financial and powers of appointment is something that could be put into place to sort of beef up the role and strength that local scrutiny panels have?
I just go back to what I said in one of my opening answers to a question, and I'm just paraphrasing. I'm afraid I don't have the exact quote, but paraphrasing the Chief Constable who said from his appointment, which has been very warmly welcomed, I think, across the board, that he is very keen to see how they can further devolve policing to local communities. I leave it at that. I think that shows that there is a willingness and a scope to look at sensible measures that are brought forward that allow communities a greater say in how they are policed.
John.
Cabinet Secretary, you said you didn't want to be accused of interfering, except that you do. The good news for you is you do it with the blessing of all the other opposition parties, and that comes with this fixation with the figure 17,234. Would you acknowledge that?
Well, we've moved away from that figure in the sense that it wasn't in our manifesto for 2016. I think that's been understood. In fact, I think that was true of almost all the manifestos. I don't know about the green one in particular, I have to say, and whether that was in your manifesto or not. But this idea that the Chief Constable now should be given the space to create a balanced workforce, I think is absolutely right. Now, that is very much predicated on my responsibilities to keep Scotland safer, which is operational capability. Any reduction in police officer numbers, HMICS will do the oversight in relation to ensuring that there's enhanced operational capability and there's no detriment to the service due to those reduction in those numbers. But I think we're in a position now and in a place now where we have to allow the Chief Constable to create that balanced workforce.
Well, that's very good going forward. You're right to say this is retrospective examination. So, with regard to that figure, and the often not picked up on fact that this was 10 rather than 8 organisations that had to be rationalised, and that police officers cannot be redundant. Chief officers, and I welcome the reduction there wasn't, chief officers didn't have their contracts renewed. But was there not an inevitability that there would be an effect on the front line? We've heard varying views about the resilience in the front line brought about by the insistence on that figure.
So just expand slightly on what you're saying.
Well, if you can't make officers redundant, and I wouldn't seek to make officers redundant, if you can't make officers redundant and the only part of your staff that you can make redundant, is police support staff, then this led to the inevitable situation of the backfilling of posts. So indeed officers who might otherwise have been deployed on what would be referred to as frontline duties were actually sitting in offices doing tasks, and I think acknowledged not as well as the police staff who had been there before them.
I think look, some of the reduction of police staff is going to be inevitable when you take out duplication of a number of forces coming together. So there's no doubt that was going to be a consequence of that. I also don't, but in the same vein, I don't take away from what John Finney says, and always, always value what John Finney says because of his experience, of course, in the police. But I don't take away from what he says. So what we've seen in terms of the recent numbers, we've seen, of course, in terms of the latest publication of numbers, we've seen a more balanced workforce which will deploy people and officers back onto the front line absolutely where they should be. Now, there'll be some element where, of course, some officers will have to take a more kind of, will not be able to be in the front line for maybe pregnant, injured, sick. Yeah. That is understandable. But I certainly see from the latest statistics that I've had and that I've seen that we are seeing more officers, you can say, being taken out of those back filling posts and certainly on the front line.
Cabinet Secretary, are you able to say the lessons the Scottish Government learned as regards strengthening the connection between service and communities from the way that the issue of the deployment of armed officers was dealt with, and also the issue of stop and search?
Both issues are always important to learn from, and it just goes back to the answers I've given to previous questions, that the greater alignment we can have between not just local needs but also the desires and wishes of local communities around the two subjects he mentioned, but also other equally subjects that invoke emotion, rightly so and understandably so. The more alignment we can have between the national service and the local needs, desires and priorities, the better. Now, I think we have some structures in place to do some of that, but where that can be improved, then we should absolutely look at that. And yes, learning lessons from previous issues, absolutely. But we have to say that we look at issues around stop and search, around having an armed capability, then that will invoke different emotions and reactions from different people. These are always going to be contentious issues, I don't doubt. But having an alignment with local desires, I think, is incredibly important.
Do you think community impact assessments are an important role, and do you think they've been sufficiently used by Police Scotland? Again, with regard to these two issues, perhaps?
I would have to look back at these two issues specifically. I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to say from the kind of top of my head whether or not the sufficient community impact assessments were had taken place when these issues were being discussed, and I'm happy to look into that and provide perhaps more detail to John Finney. That is retrospective, looking forward, as I'm trying to do and intending to do in my new role. There's a new Chief Constable there, a new Chair of SPA, I say new Chair, almost a year into role, but a new Chief Exec of SPA, that we are all committed to absolutely ensuring that there is as much consultation and engagement at a local level when it comes to defining our policing strategies moving forward.
Well, I think I might be able to save you that work. I think it's perhaps been done, but if I give you the example of the armed officers, I don't think any reasonable person would assume a line in a paraphrase here, we'll standardise police deployment operations for AFO, authorised firearms across Scotland, would see a situation where previously armed police officers within vehicles would be patrolling Inverness High Street. So it would be good if lessons would be learned from the approach. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Liam Kerr.
Good morning again. Just sticking with your point, Cabinet Secretary, that it's not ideal for the Scottish Government to have too great a role in Police Scotland. This committee has looked at the appointments process for the chair and members of the SPA. So do you take a view on, could the current appointments process, being as it is made by the Scottish ministers, lead to at least a perception that the organisation is not as independent as it should and could be?
Again, we will reflect on you know, any sensible suggestions that are made in relation to how we can strengthen some of these processes. What I would say is my understanding is, and Donna will keep me right here, but my understanding is for the appointment of Susan Deakin as the chair, then the convener of the subcommittee, Mary Fee, I think at the time, had a role to play in that appointments process. So that gave, of course, the Parliament a role very much in that. I think that was the right thing to do, and it seems to have been a successful appointment process. And again, people have been largely welcoming of Susan Deakin's appointment and recognise the work that she's done in her first kind of 11 months in the role. So I think where there's a sensible space to have a conversation around how we strengthen these processes, then absolutely. At the same time, I make the point, of course, the Scottish Government is the sponsor, and therefore, of course, SPA being accountable to us is hugely important, and we can't kind of dismiss that. It's not an insignificant fact, but where we can look to strengthen processes, I'll do my best to keep an open mind. I have to say, on the appointments process, there with the convener of the subcommittee being involved and part of that, I think that's a positive development.
Clarify, Cabinet Secretary, that was a one-off arrangement. Are you saying that that's something that you would look to change and build in to the
I'm open-minded. I'm open-minded to that suggestion. I think it worked well the last time. You know, whether that arrangement was informal or we wanted to formalise it, be open-minded to that discussion.
But you will be aware at that time there was some criticism, maybe not from all the members, but I certainly had some concerns that to then involve the police subcommittee chair, who will then be in the appointment and then be performing the role of assessing and scrutinising that role, is potentially causing a bit of a conflict.
Again, if there are other suggestions of ways to improve that, but also give the Parliament some sort of role, then I would look at that. I think where my concerns would be, and others have mentioned that perhaps, you know, allowing Parliament and for example, a role in the sense that all political parties being involved in the process. I just would be in danger of politicising any appointment. I think we'd have to just be careful about that particular difficulty and challenge. But you know, if there are other suggestions on how to strengthen the appointments process, certainly, as I say, I will take an open-minded approach to that. I thought the last one worked well. I don't take away from what the conveners have said. But there might be another way of perhaps strengthening that.
Okay. Liam Kerr.
It's perhaps a question for the Minister. It has been suggested that some of the early challenges within Police Scotland were down to personalities and certain clashes and responsibilities between those in charge. It would appear that the SFRS hasn't had the same issues. So do you draw a conclusion that the early challenges in the police, and perhaps those challenges not being faced in the SFRS, were simply down to personalities? And if so, doesn't that beg the possibility that it could happen again?
I think the 2012 Act obviously, you know, had two very different organisations that it brought into effect there. And obviously the Fire and Rescue Service is quite considerably smaller than the police service as well. So I think that possibly has had some effect on complexity and so on. But two very different organisations and very different legacy issues as well. So I think we have to take that into account also. And the other difference, I think, between police and fire was that fire have a much more straightforward organisational model. And I think that has worked well for them. So that's what I would say on that.
It has been suggested to us that the 2012 Act wasn't sufficiently clear about the respective roles and responsibilities of both the SPA and Police Scotland. So does the Scottish Government take a view on whether it would be useful to amend the 2012 Act to provide greater clarity about the roles and responsibilities of Police Scotland SPA, or, as we heard in evidence from, I think, the SPA, do you take the view that the Act is the Act and there are better ways to achieve that?
Yeah, I think I'm more in the view in alignment with the SPA on this one. I have to say, it feels to be, again, being relatively new into role, of course, but it feels to me that with the new chair, again, relatively new chair, new chief constable, hopefully with a new chief executive that comes with a wealth of experience, obviously a new CAPSEC in place, that we are in a place where we have some fresh faces, undoubtedly, there, but also we are seeing, I think, certainly more stability in the chief constable and the chair have a lot to do with that. I have to say, and I think anybody would recognise, even if you are critical, I think anybody would recognise that the chair of the SPA has really been working her socks off and working really hard to try to improve structures. Now, when it comes to key learnings, I noticed that the SPA improvement plan 1819 sets out key improvements of how it works, responding and recommendations to 14 different reviews, inspections and audits. So we've got a plan to move forward. I think going back to your question to the Minister, if I may just come in on that, around the personalities, I think it's around approach, which is hugely important. I think, again, if people recognise that Susan Deacon's approach and Ian Livingston, the Chief Constable's approach, has been very open, has been to engage, has been to welcome transparency and accountability. And I think that is really, really important. And that is equally, of course, the approach the government has had and will continue to have also. So, you know, I think it is not the time to be necessarily kind of taking up time-consuming amendments to legislation. I think the structures are there, the processes are there, the improvement plans are in place to improve things for the future.
If I could press you on that in particular, Cabinet Secretary, then certainly they have seemed to work more collaboratively. And you know, that brings you down, down to personalities and the governance structures. The new SPA chair has certainly been looking at that to try and make improvements within Police Scotland. But can I ask you, is there a potential conflict of interest with the SPA's dual role, which is to work in that collaborative way, to look at improvements within Police Scotland, and also to provide that independent scrutiny of how the police is working? For it seems to me that it's that dual role that has perhaps caused the problems in the past.
I'm not entirely convinced. Again, I will listen to the evidence session and what you and others have to say, in particular around this. I mean, anybody that has encountered Susan knows that you know, she will not be afraid to challenge, and I can see that she does that robustly when it is required. And I know from speaking to the Chief Constable that you know, maybe somewhat counterintuitively, but he welcomes that robust challenge. I don't think the issues within the roles and responsibilities. I think the way SPA is working now, you know, it provides the ability to robustly challenge, while at the same time making sure that priorities are aligned. So I don't see it as a conflict. I will look through the evidence sessions that you've taken clearly, and I'll look through them in depth. But again, it didn't seem to me that that was a kind of key issue or key theme that was coming out of the evidence sessions that you took either.
Yeah, I think the chair did mention, you know, perception was important, as indeed it is, and with the secondment of government officials in the interim to try and improve governance relations, then again, it's the independent scrutiny aspect that I would welcome the Cabinet Secretary's thoughts on, and the fact that he is prepared to look back on that and see if there could be an issue there. Who is it? Rona.
Okay, thank you. If I could ask the Minister, please, the Fire Brigade Union had some concerns that the SFRS board didn't have enough operational expertise in the board, and they asked that maybe the composition could be looked at. I wonder if I could have your reaction to that.
So there's no evidence that there's any significant challenges or concerns regarding the makeup of the board, and obviously legislation supports that the right skills and expertise are available, and the chair can obviously decide on what expertise and skills that she needs on the board and recruit them appropriately. And obviously there were 6 new members have been appointed to the board quite recently, covering extra skills like digital and accountancy. So I don't think there's any need for amendments in the legislation to change that in any way. There is also a significant amount of operational experience as well, because obviously the chief officer, the deputy chief officers and also assistant chief officers can attend, and obviously there is a vast amount of operational experience between all of them. If any more is needed, there's obviously the inspector as well, so that can be called on. Additional seconded expertise can be brought in for specific challenges as and when they require. So I think that there's significant operational expertise already available to the board.
Okay, thank you.
Minister, if we could return to the governance aspect, and you'll be aware that Unison Police Staff Scotland has raised questions around the governance, which needs greater openness and clarity in their view concerning ministerial decision-making. And they've stated it's been difficult to see where boundaries are and where ministerial advice and guidance starts, and instruction, direction and intervention end. Could you comment on that aspect?
To some extent, some of that will be subjective and it will be a point of, and it has been, of course, a point of political debate recently, where we think guidance, where we think the Act can be strengthened to demonstrate that, then again, I'll keep an open mind. I don't think that the Act has to be amended, I have to say, for this particular issue. But I go back to, convener, the point that you made, that perception is incredibly important. Now, I have a responsibility to ensure our communities are kept as safe as possible. The relationship that I've managed to strike up with Susan Deacon and the Chief Constable is a very positive and collaborative one. Now, it's one where we'll often challenge, and we talked about, for example, challenging robustly the kind of ICT case that's been put before me, so we'll challenge where appropriate. But equally, we are aligned in terms of the priorities and the overarching priorities we wish to see. As much transparency in those conversations, as much transparency, in those interactions, the better. And I welcome that, as opposed to shy away from it.
Could I ask more specifically how you see yourself using your powers of ministerial direction? Will there be any pavers, always by you in writing, papers in writing, or to the SPA? I'd note in particular that in the Unison submission, they call for shaping our national police service. There needs to be greater clarity, more openness about ministerial decision-making, how decisions are arrived at and applied and accounted for by way of records, minutes, all very important for transparency and openness, especially when you're talking about this collaborative working. I think there needs to be on the other side a trail of what's been discussed on these minutes and records.
I don't disagree. I understand the need for transparency, the need for appropriate notes to be taken. I think equally, even our harshest critics will recognise that there's an importance to have a space to be able to talk very frankly with colleagues. It doesn't matter what ministerial portfolio you have, to talk to stakeholders. But that can never be at the expense of making sure that we have appropriately recorded notes, minutes, and so on, which, again, I don't shy away from at all. So, I will look carefully at what Eunice and others have said around the transparency question. If indeed the committee comes with recommendations around that, then again, I will keep an open mind to that. My conversations that I've had with the chair and with the Chief Constable have been very positive. They have been very collaborative. There's no nothing sinister in those conversations. So I'm more than happy that we continue to be meticulous in our note keeping and, of course, transparency.
Just finally, given the controversy around the last Chief Constable returning and the SPA involvement, ministerial involvement, will it be clear and minuted when you're directing the SPA?
I don't see why it wouldn't be the case, I have to say. Again, I don't wish to get into what ended up being, I think, a very political hot topic around, the previous chief constable. I deny the accusation of my predecessor and interfering, and I think he was absolutely right to ask the questions that he did. In fact, if he hadn't asked those questions, I think others would have pulled him up for that. But I don't wish to get into the detail of that. I think probably unhelpful. And the general point that you make and others make around having as much transparency, having minutes, having notes, yes, absolutely. But if there are specific recommendations made, then we will look at that.
As you say, it's about moving forward, and I think we all welcome that commitment that you would look at directly making a minute of any direction to the SPA. Right, Daniel.
I mean, just on that very point, and I accept what you're saying about not wanting to go over the detail. However, the key issue was about whether or not the chair of the police authority had an option or not, and what status that had. In that light, and thinking about moving forward, do you think it would be constructive to have a set of protocols so it was clear as to whether or not something constituted merely a suggestion rather than instruction? And likewise, I mean, I note with interest that the Deputy Mayor of London has a page on the Mayor's website with all the minutes of the meetings that they have held with successive office holders with the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, so that you can see on whatever date they met what they discussed, not at length, but a sentence or two on each topic. Do you think a proposal, these two proposals, protocols and published minutes, when you meet with the Chief Constable or other senior police officers, would be a sensible, non-legislative improvement that could be made to the way that we govern our police?
Again, if there are recommendations being made by this committee, I will give them an open mind. I haven't seen the website that he refers to in terms of the Deputy Mayor of London. I will look at that after the committee, and certainly again, if there are recommendations to improve transparency and accountability, I have no problem with them. Now, as I say, I think everybody around this table will understand that there has to be a space for any ministers and cabinet secretaries to be able to be very frank, and he made reference to a kind of note or two or a sentence or two in some of the notes. So there's an understanding, I think, that there has to be a space for government ministers to be able to have that frank conversation with stakeholders. But notwithstanding that, absolutely, the more transparency that we have, the better. I don't shy away from that. In terms of, again, I'm not wishing to go back, but there has to be a distinction between being challenging and asking questions of our stakeholders versus giving direction and as others might view it as interfering, and that sometimes, because of the political atmosphere, the roles that we each have in government and opposition, that will often be a subjective consideration. And I just think, whatever protocols we have in place, that doesn't necessarily mean that we will necessarily avoid that conversation from taking place. But again, I go back to my central point, that if there are recommendations made by the committee and others of how to improve transparency, then I will look at them with an open mind. I can't commit to doing X, Y, Z right here, right now, but certainly I will look at them with an open mind.
Welcome, Cabinet Secretary. And again, going back to the Unison submission, they did look at the greater transparency, the legislative framework, and suggested that analogous bodies in Scotland could perform this function, such as Audit Scotland. And perhaps that's again going back to this dual role of the SPA, where they're working collaboratively, trying to improve the police force and putting in very welcome suggestions for how it could be approved, but yet having to carry out that independent scrutiny. Is that something you would consider also?
Again, I just keep reiterating that where there are recommendations made by the committee and others, I will keep an open mind to that. It's worth saying that I do believe we have robust processes in place. The civil service has guidelines on minuting and note-taking, which I know my officials in my private office are, they're very, very alert to whenever we have conversations with stakeholders. So there are good process and guidance in place. Where there are lessons to learn from other bodies, then again, I just go back to my earlier answer that I certainly would be open-minded without firmly committing to one particular action or the other. I would be open-minded to seeing what the committee and others have in terms of recommendations on this front.
Thank you. John?
Cabinet Secretary, you'll be aware we've had a number of representations made to us about a variety of things, and one of them was from the Scottish Human Rights Commission, which has made a number of recommendations. They believe that human rights should be explicitly articulated in the 2012 Act, and you may recall that indeed I had an amendment to that Act which included a new oath for officers would give an undertaking to uphold the citizens' human rights, but that had no retrospective application. If I quickly take you through, there's 5 issues. A code of ethics for policing is in place. They believe it should be placed in a statutory footing, and I wonder what your view on that is. In relation to the SPA, Section 2 says that they should try to carry out its functions in a way which is proportionate, accountable and transparent, and they believe that the word try should be deleted. And in relation to the SPA, again, they believe they should have independence and power to set its own strategic priorities, and I think that would align with some of the comments we've heard earlier. Two very particular ones relate to legislation. The optional protocol to the United Nations Convention Against Torture, independent custody visiting, and that would be to put HMICS on a statutory footing and make clear what the purpose is. And finally, they have understandable concerns that Section 94, subparagraph 4, gives authority for the refusal of a visit to a constable who's directly responsible. Will you undertake to look at all of these issues?
Oof, there are a few. There's quite a few.
I don't mean instantly, Cabinet Secretary, but
yes,
I'm sure that there are a body that's put in place to make recommendations to the government. And
look, I have a huge amount of time for the Scottish Human Rights Commission, interacted with them in many a year gone by. Certainly, actually, in my current role, it would probably be a good idea to interact with them and meet with them, so I'll commit to do that. Obviously, you mentioned a few issues, 5 issues, I think, in total. Some of those I can see where I would like to have a further conversation with Scottish Human Rights Commission. Some of them may well come out in the recommendations from the committee on OPCAT, and you know, I've recently had a conversation, and previously as a minister also engaged with OPCAT before in a different ministerial role as well. You know, again, let's look at the recommendations being made in relation to visiting custody suites and so on and so forth. But again, because of the nature of custody suites, and I know John Finney will understand this, that there may well be times when a visit just would not be appropriate, perhaps a disorder or whatever in a custody suite. So there has to be to that power and to that refusal power, there has to be checks and balances. So if Scottish Human Rights Commission are coming back saying the checks and balances are not good enough, then that is something that I would have to look at, and I would welcome a conversation with them and obviously with Police Scotland and others around that. So you can have an absolute assurance from me that, you know, throughout my life, the role of human rights in our justice system, let alone in other parts of society, has been at the forefront of my mind very often. And I will make an undertaking to meet with the Scottish Human Rights Commission and address, look, see if we can have a conversation around these 5 issues, but also some wider issues in and around the justice system also.
Okay, thank you. That's very reassuring.
As you say, Cabinet Secretary, that's a really important issue and a very wide-ranging one. I think the committee would be very grateful if you could provide us with some feedback on these 5 points, and after you've held that meeting.
And the meeting did, and there'll be minutes, so I'll make sure that there's some feedback.
That's very encouraging. Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. We now move on to police complaints. Rona.
Thank you. Yes, if I could ask you about the complaints and investigations procedure with regard to transparency and equity. Can I ask you if you think the complaints processes are too complex, and what could be done to ensure greater transparency and clarity? And I'm sort of referring to the fact that, you know, senior police officers have a different, should they be prioritised, and junior officers have a different process to go through, and should there be one complaints handling system for all?
I think these are all good questions to to ask. I also think, though, there's an important space for us to give to Alicia Angelini's review on complaints handling and procedures. And I have met with Dame Alicia Angelini, and I think everybody holds on very high pedigree, rightly so. It would be, I think, wrong for me to try to prejudge some of what will come out of that. Very helpfully, if I remember correctly, Alicia Angelini will produce some interim findings in spring next year. That will allow some of that kind of work that needs to be done sooner rather than later to be done. I think, without putting words at all into Dame Alicia Angelini's mouth, you know, she said to me, where things can be fixed quickly, then they should be. But I think we have to be able to give her space to do the review, the important review that she's doing, and where there are specific quick measures where there's unanimity around that they can be fixed. If that is the view of stakeholders, then there's no reason why we shouldn't look to that.
Okay, thank you.
I wonder, Cabinet Secretary, do you have a time frame for the Angelini report, phase 1, phase 2?
I will look to my officials, but I think the interim review findings are spring of next year, and then 9 to 12 months after that would be the full review after that. But I'll look towards my officials.
Thank you. Daniel, then Liam Kerr.
So just following on from that, and bearing in mind, I accept your point about the Angelini review. If I was being unfair to you, I'd ask how many different routes you think that complaints can be taken both by police and by the public. But rather than doing that, because I'm not sure I could with any confidence, if you'd agree with me that I think there are 4 for police, if you include senior officers and whistleblowing, and 3 for the public. And likewise, for both of those, there are 3 organisations that can have locus, both the police themselves, the SPA, and the PERC. Even just in terms of that enumeration, I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would agree with me that it seems like a cluttered landscape and that a streamlined process is perhaps needed.
Daniel Johnson, I think, always articulates his points with great thought, and you've done that and demonstrated that with that question. I hope he will understand when I say I really am extremely cautious of prejudging Dame Alicia Angelini's review, but notwithstanding that, I can absolutely see from the question that he's asked and from the knowledge that I have that there could be a perception of a cluttered landscape, a perception that things could be made simpler. And again, these are exactly the type of issues that Alicia Angelini will give thorough scrutiny and consideration to. And I imagine that we will pore over her review, both her interim findings, no doubt, and her full report. Yeah, I don't doubt that these are some of the issues that I know for a fact these are some of the issues that she's very much looking at.
And can I ask whether her report will look at whistleblowing? Because some concern has been expressed about the independence of the regime that has been put in place by the police, in particular the fact that the independence that the police have sought is limited to the fact that a charity based in England will be the body that whistleblowers will initially approach. Once that report of whistleblowing has been taken, that then gets reported to the line and dealt with by police officers themselves. I mean, I think the concern about whether or not that process is independent, I think, is well made. So is that going to be part of the review? And if not, I was just wondering what the Cabinet Secretary's thoughts on that point about independence and whistleblowing would be.
Well, when I look at the terms of reference for Dame Alicia Angelini's review, they are very wide in the sense that she has the power. They're quite wide-ranging to look at the issue of whistleblowing. Whether she specifically is or isn't, you'll forgive me, I'll take that back. And in fact, it would be a question for Dame Angelini to answer. But there's nothing stopping her from her review from looking at that issue of whistleblowing. I couldn't tell you definitively whether she is or isn't, so you'll forgive me that I don't have the answer to the top of my head. In terms of whistleblowing generally, again, I think these matters are incredibly important across our public services, whether it's police or health or any other, frankly, as well. I know that 2 years ago, Police Scotland introduced their portal called Integrity Matters. That allows staff, it allows officers to raise any particular issues or indeed make any allegations, but it's a system that is, importantly, it's not just robust and effective, but importantly, of course, it's confidential, which is what whistleblowers undoubtedly will look for, that confidence in it being confidential. But there also a note here that all matters reported via this system are assessed by, a National Gateway Assessment Unit. That can be dealt with away from local areas to very much protect the confidentiality and give assurances of confidence in the process. I'm not seeing any evidence for a completely different or indeed a kind of completely independent need for a whistleblowing system. But again, if that is something that Dame Alicia Angelini is looking at, and that is some of the recommendations that come forth from her review, then of course we would give that consideration. But having looked through the evidence sessions that you've had, I've not seen that there is necessarily a particular need for that. But again, as always, I will keep my mind open on the question.
I think one of the critical issues within the realm of whistleblowing touches on a wider issue, which is about the way complaints get handled by the line. And I think Kate Frame's evidence that she gave to us last week, I think highlighted a number of areas of concern, particularly around the classification of complaints and the fact that very serious issues then subsequently got handled at a frontline level rather than being escalated as a matter of the way that they were recorded. And I was just wondering if the Cabinet Secretary would agree with me that recording unlawful detention as quality of service or questioning or complaints about the way a rape investigation was being carried out, as classifying that as incivility, and likewise allegations of assault being recorded as excessive force is worrying, because each and every one of those things surely should require escalation and be treated with the utmost seriousness. And the fact that the PERC only looked at those because the individuals knew to complain to her, that in and of itself, I think, highlights the issues with the process, because if that hadn't been done, we wouldn't know about those issues.
To meet with the Commissioner later today, and I've no doubt that questions that have risen since our evidence will be part of the conversation that we undoubtedly have. I also note that obviously the committee has a representation from Police Scotland in relation to challenging some of that, and I think you've also had recently further evidence from the PERC as well in relation to that. So I don't intend to kind of step into the specifics of those issues, other than, I know, for example, that quite a robust challenge from Police Scotland around, that rape and any criminal investigation would be investigated as a criminal matter if it's a criminal matter.
Well, on that very point, Cabinet Secretary, I think it's really important to be clear on this. The complaint wasn't about the rape itself, it was about the way in which a rape investigation was being carried out. And indeed, the rebuttal from the police is against that misconception of what Ms Frame said, not what she actually said. But more importantly, Ms Frame describes that as an attempt to pervert the course of justice. And I think that we should take any statement such as that made by the PERC extremely seriously. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that if the PERC describes something happening in the police as an attempt to pervert the course of justice, that's an extremely serious matter?
No, I agree. The charge and the accusation being made is an extremely serious one. I don't doubt that. As I say, I'm due to meet with the Commissioner later today. Excuse me. I don't doubt that some of what she raised during her evidence session will be part of that conversation. There's no disagreement between Daniel Johnson and I that an accusation made like that is an extremely serious one, and I will listen very carefully to what the Commissioner absolutely has to say on some of this.
And just finally, and I recognise this will be part of the Angelini review, but I think one of the key points I think Ms Frame is pointing out is the fact that is very circumstantial as to whether or not these things come to the attention of the PERC at all. And I'm just wondering whether or not the Cabinet Secretary would agree with me that some examination of the ability of the PERC to actually look at any particular complaint, either retrospectively or by way of triage, is a consideration that certainly needs to be examined as part of the Angelini review.
Yeah, I have confidence that it will be as well. Again, I can't speak for Dame Eilish Angelini, but certainly from the conversations I've had, I've got no doubt that these are exactly the type of issues that she will look at. I absolutely give a commitment from my perspective to listen carefully to what the Commissioner has to say. And of course, you know, when it comes to Eilish Angelini's actual review, I've got no doubt also that Daniel Johnson, but collectively as a committee, you will also make your views known to that very, what I expect will be a very thorough review.
Thank you.
We've got Liam Kerr, Liam McCarthy and then John Finney.
Thank you, Convener. Just sticking with the complaint system, but coming out of the specifics that Daniel Johnson's alluded to, given the suggestions that this committee's heard by the Park in evidence to the committee, does the Cabinet Secretary take a view on whether it's appropriate that Police Scotland can effectively choose which complaints about themselves are investigated? And does the Cabinet Secretary think that the law might need to be reviewed or amended to stipulate specifically the types of complaints that the police should investigate and the types that they pass to either Park or the Crown?
Look, in any organisation, there's kind of internal complaints procedures, and the police obviously has that, but the public does have recourse if they believe that that complaint has not been handled appropriately by Police Scotland or the SPA. Does have recourse to the Park to look at how those complaints were handled, and that is really exceptionally important. Notwithstanding all of that, there is the Eilish Angelini review, and I'm sorry that I keep going back to it, but it is so important that in my role I don't prejudge any of that. But there is recourse for the public to go to the Park to ask questions about how a specific complaint has been handled, and that is important.
And we've also heard in this committee some evidence that it is unsatisfactory that non-criminal complaints are halted upon the point of an officer's resignation or retirement. It's been suggested it's unsatisfactory for both parties, the complainer and the one who is complained about. I put the question to the Chief Constable, who said it's a matter for Parliament. So I put the question to yourself, Cabinet Secretary. Do you take a view on whether the regulations around this need to be amended? And if so, should that be done immediately? Or again, do we wait the outcome of Dame Angelini's review?
Again, I'd be quite keen to look at the review, even if it's the interim findings that we'll get in spring next year. When it comes to the complainer in particular, but also the one being complained about, but certainly the complainer, if they remain within the organisation, so the situation as you described it, with the one who's being complained about resigns or retires, the complainer may well still be in the organisation. There is a duty of care which is exceptionally important for that organisation, in this case Police Scotland. I know how importantly the Chief Constable and the Chair of SPA take that duty of care for the welfare of their officers and staff, and I think that is hugely important. Again, I take the view that on this wider issue, that there is a review taking place by somebody who has an incredible amount of pedigree, respect and credibility and integrity on this issue in particular, but of course across the board. And I think it would be sensible for us to, of course, put our views to Dame Eilish Angelini, particularly, opposition, particularly the Justice Committee. But it would be sensible to wait for the outcome, at least in the interim, of some of those review findings.
What is your view, Cabinet Secretary?
Again, I'm not willing to prejudge that. I will be open-minded. I mean, if this committee comes forward with recommendations on the very thorough evidence sessions that you've had, all I can do at this stage is promise you an open mind to some of those recommendations being made. But I would, be wary when there is a review taking place that is going to be thorough, that's going to be, I think, forensic on these issues, that we give Dame Eilish Angelini the appropriate space to do that work.
Can I press you on that just a little bit, Cabinet Secretary? Is it your position then that there are no issues that should be prioritised now, and in effect we can wait up to what could potentially be 18 months before we address some of the very concerning and serious information that we've received from the Park?
No, I don't think that. And I said in my previous answers that where there are, first of all, recommendations from the Justice Committee of areas to give further examination of that. The government will do that, absolutely, and we'll keep, I personally, as Cabinet Secretary, will keep an open mind to that. So where there are recommendations, where there is potentially, and this will be difficult, of course, given the nature of the conversation that we're having, but where there is unanimity around particular issues that can be changed and should be changed for the better and for the purposes of improving procedures, then again we should look at that. But I just simply say that I think there is a very thorough review that is taking place. We should be, I think, wary of prejudging that, but where we can add value to that, then I don't have any issues whatsoever. So no, I'm not suggesting that we can't do anything until the full review findings. That would be wrong. There are interim, as I say, findings due to be published in spring next year. If there are issues the committee think that should be looked at even before those interim findings, then again I will keep an open mind to what the committee has to say.
Right, and you mentioned adding value. Would that go further? And you know, if the Parliament can amend subordinate legislation now, would you look at that as a possibility to address what may transpire to be a fundamental issue affecting the credibility of Police Scotland and the public's perception?
Yeah, I think legislative fixes are never necessarily very quick. Well, as you go through, obviously, will always take a considerable amount of time, or relative amount of time, I think. Therefore, you know, if there was a particular legislative fix or legislative amendment that the committee thought should be made, I would have thought it would be sensible to wait to see what the Elise Angelino review has to say in relation to this particular issue. But saying all of that, if there is a legislative amendment that the convener and the committee collectively think should and needs to be explored and looked at, then I will give that immediate attention if that is the recommendation of this committee.
Thank you. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much. We were talking earlier, Cabinet Secretary, about some of the problems that were created in the early stages for Police Scotland due to either a lack of clarity or a disagreement between particularly Police Scotland and the SPA about their respective roles. I think layered on to that were some personality conflicts that at times supercharged those problems. What we've just described, and Daniel Johnson I think set it out very fairly, is what appears to be a lack of clarity or a disagreement about what should be the respective roles of Police Scotland and the PERC in terms of handling certain types of complaints or indeed whistleblowing. Do you not see the potential risks if there isn't early clarification or an agreement between the parties about how best to proceed? I mean, I certainly wouldn't dispute that certain types of whistleblowing, it's entirely appropriate that should be handled within Police Scotland. That's where the resolution will rest and is a way of bringing the parties together more amicably, I suspect, going forward. But in other instances, we can, I think, both think of circumstances where that would be less likely to happen and independence is needed. But at the moment, there seems to be a bit of a risk that we have a growing disagreement between PERC and Police Scotland about their respective roles or what their respective roles should be. And that as Cabinet Secretary, it is for you to help bring those parties together and find the clarity that is needed now.
Well, as I say, I'm meeting with the Commissioner later on today, and I'll be keen to hear what Kate Frame's view is on some of what Liam MacArthur has said. If there are specific recommendations that he or, I should say, the committee has in relation to this question, then I can't do more than reiterate my stance of being open-minded to looking at those if there are particular actions that I can take. Yes, I will see and examine and explore what I can do to ensure that roles and responsibilities are understood, but we also have a complaints procedure in place that has absolute public confidence. But again, I keep going back to the Elise Angelino review. I think it is important to give her the space. She will forensically look at these issues that Lee MacArthur has spoken about. But certainly, yes, I see it as part of my role and my responsibility to see where we can get organisations working collaboratively, understanding each other's roles and responsibilities, and where there's tensions exist between any organisations, to see whether they can be smoothed out.
Would it also be possible, I think, with Dame Eilish Angelini to clarify whether or not she would look at issues around the protection of the welfare of whistleblowers? We've had evidence from a number of individuals who have experience of going through the complaints, going through the whistleblowing process, and I think in each instance there is at least a concern expressed about the efforts that are gone to in, as I say, protecting the welfare of individuals who are going through an incredibly stressful process. So is there an undertaking you can give the committee that as far as you're concerned, that would be an area you would hope or expect Dame Eilish Angelini to look into?
Can I maybe suggest a slightly alternative approach, though the committee can, of course, make its own mind up, but it may be for the committee to approach Dame Eilish Angelini to ask directly whether or not these are issues that she would be reviewing and examining. I share Lee MacArthur's expectations that these are the kind of issues that would be discussed, but I am very wary, having just had a conversation about interfering versus not, of giving Dame Eilish Angelini absolutely the independence that she needs to look at these issues, particularly on the nature of the review that she's looking at. You know, there is no need for me to act as a middleman. You know, the committee and yourself is, of course, an MSP, you can make that direct approach. But yes, in terms of sharing your expectations, I think these are the kind of issues that Dame Eilish Angelini will be looking at.
And just finally, as part of that review, would you expect her to look at the role played by the Justice Secretary in those various relationships, Police Scotland, SPA, PERC and others, or is this solely for the purposes of Police Scotland and those other bodies?
I don't expect, nor would I like, the Scottish Government to be exempt from the scrutiny of the review at all. I fully expect that, again, without putting words into Dame Eilish Angelini's mouth at all, that the Government will also be a part of that scrutiny, as well as the various stakeholders and bodies she's mentioned.
Okay, thank you.
We'll be happy to write to Dame Eilish and just confirm that whistleblowing is part of a review. If I could ask you finally, Cabinet Secretary, ACC Spears suggested that only 5% of persons who made a complaint about the police subsequent request that PERC conduct a complaint handling review. That meant that consequently the 95% are sufficiently satisfied with the manner that the complaint was handled. The PERC had a different view from that. They said of the 5%, 50% were upheld as not being handled properly. And their concern was that unless someone had the tenacity, the wit and the perseverance to then take it a bit further and ask for that complaint handling review, they had absolutely no way of knowing if they had been handled properly and if an independent scrutiny and assessment should have been made. And indeed, many of the issues that's raised in the PERC's final submission have come from that 5% where they've found, it has to be said, very concerning issues. Could you comment on that?
Well, the first thing is, you know, we absolutely value the role that the PERC plays and the job it does. That is why, as a government, we increased its budget when we did, and that was important for us to do. I'll go back to Lee MacArthur's point that he made around getting a kind of frontline resolution to these issues where possible, not appropriate in every case at all. That's understandable, but where appropriate, that is something that is to be encouraged where it is appropriate. In terms of the wider question and the PERC's view of this, again, meeting with Kate Frame later today. It will absolutely be part of the conversation that we have. I'd be keen to hear from her directly and the one-to-one that we have around where we can improve and where there are perhaps deficiencies within the system. But I go back to the Dame Elise Angelini review as well. I think that there is exactly the type of issues that will be explored by Elise, and I've got full confidence in her doing so.
I think that's a huge area. Complaints and how these are handled is the difference with people thinking the police service is working well and we got a result and our concerns were looked at, and to getting into a position where the good work that's being carried out and the excellent work our frontline officers do can be caught up in the criticism. So I see that's an absolutely key area, especially given the comments from PERC about the delay even when they get to look at this independent scrutiny from CT coverage footage, from the records in hospital of what actually was recorded, what kind of incident it was. So I would suggest that's something that's fairly urgent, Cabinet Secretary. I wonder if you'd agree.
I will look at that if you don't mind after the committee, and I will have a conversation today, as I say, with the Commissioner on that very issue. So I go back to my previous answer to the convener. There may be some things that are viewed as more urgent and not being able to wait for Elise Angelini's interim findings or indeed her full findings. And I can promise you an open mind. I won't commit to certain actions one way or the other, but I will keep an open mind.
Will the Cabinet inform the committee of the outcome of your meeting with PERC? I think that would be very helpful for our...
Sure. Again, I fully expect that as all these meetings that have stakeholders, it would be minuted and so on and so forth. But if you wish to have a further conversation or further information, sorry, about the particulars of that meeting, then of course I'd be happy to provide that.
That'd be extremely helpful. Minister, we've one last question for you. In looking at the retained fighter service and the recruiting of these challenges there, that was brought up as quite a major issue. Is that a priority? Is it number one priority? Where does it sit?
Obviously, operational matters, and that includes, recruitment, RDS, etc., is a matter for the SFRS. But I take on board, the evidence that the committee has taken on RDS. There are problems in RDS, and I think the SFRS would accept that absolutely. Obviously, the way that we're living our modern lives now mean that people are much less likely to, work in the village that they live in, for instance, are more likely to travel away from home during the day, which obviously does reduce the pool of people who might be interested in potentially being a retained firefighter. So I think we know it's in need of reform. We're certainly, the SFRS are looking at opportunities for reforming it. It is a priority. And the government is particularly supportive at the moment of the fact that SFRS is recruiting at the moment. So they're recruiting for whole-time managers in remote and rural areas as part of the attempt to meet this challenge that we're seeing with RDS. But absolutely it is a priority, and they are looking at innovative solutions in order to resolve this.
Right. Thank you very much. That concludes our questioning. Can I thank both the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister for appearing before us today, and we'll look forward to the additional information you promised to provide the committee. I now suspend for a comfort break. Agenda item 3 is consideration of a legislative consent memorandum for the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Bill. I refer members to paper 3, which is a note by the clerk, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement on why he's seeking the Parliament's consent. I will then invite any questions from members. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. The Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Bill was introduced on the 6th of June by the Home Office. As the title suggests, the majority of the bill relates to reserved areas of national security, with provisions which apply right across the UK. However, there are 3 areas we consider to have implications regarding devolved competence. Following the incidents in London and Manchester last year, the Home Office undertook a review of counter-terrorism legislation and policy. The outcome, including this bill, has been broadly welcomed as a considered approach to these terrible incidents. Since then, we've obviously seen despicable acts in Salisbury and further consequences in Amesbury. In response to these, the bill also contains further powers to stop, question, search and detain individuals at the United Kingdom border to determine whether they've been involved in hostile state activity. In terms of the areas specifically requiring consent, we consider there to be 3 areas. Firstly, Clause 15 of the bill amends the Road Traffic Regulation Act 1984 to enable traffic authorities, including the Scottish ministers, to impose cost recovery charges for making anti-terrorism traffic regulation orders. Secondly, the Scottish Government requested that the bill make amendments to legal aid legislation. This will ensure that persons detained at the border under the terrorism legislation have the right to non-means tested advice and assistance. Those changes are within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, but were requested as there was no legislative vehicle in an appropriate timescale that would maintain consistency across the United Kingdom. Finally, Clause 18 and 21 and their associated schedules will enable certain biometric material to be kept longer and potentially used for devolved purposes. As the Scottish Parliament could enact similar provisions extending the retention period of biometric data for devolved purposes, it's considered that these clauses also require legislative consent. The safety and security of the people of Scotland is, of course, a paramount concern for this government. The bill rightly faces scrutiny in the UK Parliament on whether its impact is appropriate and, importantly, proportionate. We'll continue to engage with the UK Government on these matters as the bill progresses. However, the clauses we're seeking your support for today enable national security legislation to be applied consistently across the UK. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Questions from members? John Finney and Daniel.
Cabinet Secretary, I'm grateful for you mentioning the terrible events in Salisbury, because I think the background to certainly part 2 of the bill, it's important to understand the background. But I have to say, I have a number of concerns regarding this. I wonder, can you tell me, and this is a question I've asked on a number of occasions to, including to your predecessors, the investigation of crime in Scotland is the responsibility of the Lord Advocate. Will he be in charge of investigations under this legislation?
I haven't had any feedback from Lord Advocate that would suggest that any of the measures would give him specific concerns in relation to extending over his jurisdiction and his remit. Where I would agree that there's certainly some concerns that have been raised around the bill. I've got no doubt that organisations will continue to be robust, as will MPs to be robust around some of the considerations around this bill. When speaking to my counterpart, the Minister, south of the border, he alluded to the fact that the government were in listening mode to some of those and would potentially bring forward some changes to the bill. But I certainly haven't had any direct representation, I should say, and I look to my officials see if they've had representation from the Lord Advocate or the Crown's Office on some of the provisions within the bill.
We've not had any direct involvement with the Lord Advocate or the Crown Office in terms of any of the issues that might relate to the investigation of crime. It would maintain the same position. The Lord Advocate would be in charge of any investigation of crimes under this legislation in Scotland, as he would be. The Crown Office have generally welcomed the provisions of the bill that relate to some of their competence in terms of, excuse me, the earlier intervention in some of the offences that might have been made in the earlier clauses of the bill, when we've talked to them about whether they felt that they were necessary and proportionate to addressing the terrorist threat that we're currently experiencing.
Okay, Cabinet Secretary, thank you. Cabinet Secretary, are you able to say whether the extension of the notification requirements to persons convicted of terrorism-related offences in the north of Ireland, does that have retrospective application?
Again, I'll hold it towards my officials, but I don't suspect so.
There's nothing in the bill, in our conversation with the Home Office, nothing in the bill will be retrospective, including that.
Okay, thank you. In relation to the retention of biometric material, the paper we have here talks about striking a better balance between enabling the police to use fingerprints and DNA to support terrorism investigations, which we would all support, and continuing to provide proportionate safeguards for civil liberties. Is there anywhere where you could outline where these appropriate safeguards for civil liberties are, please?
Well, you know, there's obviously the Biometrics Commissioner, Commissioner for Retention and Use of Biometrics material. And my understanding is that the Commissioner welcomes broadly the provisions within the bill. We also are committed to bringing forward a biometrics bill as well, which should be introduced, of course, debated in this Parliament as any piece of legislation would, and it's important for us to ensure that those checks and balances also exist for where we have devolved competencies. But there are checks and balances there. The Commissioner, of course, you know, as I say, being one of the examples of those checks and balances. And my understanding is, again, I look to officials, that Commissioner generally welcomes the provisions within the bill.
Yeah, as far as we understand our conversation with the Home Office, the Biometrics Commissioner certainly has been consulted and welcomes the provisions, and indeed 3 of the recommendations that the Commissioner made in his most recent report in 2017 are being enacted or are in this bill at the moment as they stand. Some of those relate to an extension of the period of time that national security determination biometrics can be held. That was the consideration of the Biometrics Commissioner, that there wasn't a clear reason why. At the moment, there can be extended every 2 years. That was creating some bureaucracy, and he felt that there could not be, there was no reason not to extend the absolute maximum time limit of to 5 years. That doesn't mean that people won't necessarily seek shorter extensions to that, but he felt that coming back 3 or 4 times in that period, when he could just go for one extension, was appropriate. Similarly, he felt that the ability of chief officers in England and Wales to be able to have a single national security determination meeting multiple different pieces of material was appropriate, again, given the fact that the reasons for the retention weren't changing, but the chief officers were having to come on a number of occasions to the Commissioner to seek those retention periods.
Except, Cabinet Secretary, of course, the reasons for retention are changing. And you in the briefing we have here, the material is available for general policing purposes, and you used the specific phrase devolved purposes. These are serious extensions and serious intrusions. And if the evidence we are hearing is that this is because it's administratively more convenient, then I'm certainly not persuaded by that. Not least because that information will be shared and put on the national database. Is that correct?
Well, look, currently things stand. When a person's biometric data would otherwise be destroyed, it may be retained, as you know, if the Chief Constable determines that it's necessary. You know, that's for national security determination. Currently, any extension of the retention periods not related to national security determination must be approved by the Sheriff Court. And I think that's an important, when it comes to checks and balances. I agree with John Finney on issues with biometrics, data, and so on and so forth. We have to give as much confidence as we possibly can on these issues. I think that the Act, and where it is, you know, subject to parliamentary debate and some amendments that undoubtedly will come forward to that those checks and balances are in the right space and proportionate. But you know, I recognise also that there are organisations out there that will want the government and the UK government to go further on this.
Well, specifically with regard to the Police National Database, where this information will be stored, is it not the case that there's errors on that database indeed human rights violations which stand uncorrected.
Sorry, can you say the latter part? Did you say that there was...
I said, Cabinet Secretary, that there are errors on that database. There are human rights violations which I understand may relate to photographic evidence, and they haven't been corrected. Because, you know, our obligation is to scrutinise and understand the purpose. Everyone would want an end to violence, and its maximum means, proportionate means, to address issues like this. But this is significantly moved on from when you and I sat in a Justice Committee in the last session. We were looking at much less modest proposals than this regarding this is significant intrusion.
Well, I mean, look, I don't doubt the perspective that John Finney comes from. He has no reason. There's no need to have to caveat it. I mean, I absolutely accept that he shares the desire that all of us do around keeping Scotland safe. I think there are questions that are rightly being asked around, you know, proportionality of the bill, balancing liberty and security. I have to say, I think looking at previous UK government legislation in the anti-terror space, this one, to me, actually, I take a slightly different view to John Finney. This one, to me, seems to be much more proportionate than previous ones that I have seen. Again, if he has specific issues and concerns around the checks and balances, these issues will be debated in Westminster. I know from talking to the UK government, and he can seek his own reassurances around this, that they are open-minded to see where they can make potential amendments to give confidence on these issues. But from a Scottish perspective, as I say, there's a reason why LCM is needed on three particular issues to provide some level of consistency to what I think is, by and large, proportionate, but there are rightly questions being asked, and I don't take that away from John Finney.
I don't take any issue with the traffic regulation aspect. I warmly welcome the legal aid aspect and would like to see it rolled out beyond simply those accused of those offences. Finally, excuse me, Cabinet Secretary, would you support an independent review of the PREVENT strategy?
Again, it's not something that's been raised with me specifically as Cabinet Secretary for Justice in Scotland. You know, I've somebody who's interacted with PREVENT and the strategy and how it's been rolled out in Scotland since I was a boy. You know, maybe not quite a boy, but certainly when I was younger. And you know, I always thought in Scotland we did PREVENT different to when I spoke to my friends that lived south of the border, for example. And I think it's recognised that we enact our PREVENT strategy in a way that's more community focused in Scotland. So I haven't seen those requests for an independent review from a Scottish context. If he means from
one just now, Cabinet Secretary.
Sorry?
I'm making one just now.
So, of course, anything that John Finney says, I give very careful consideration to. So if you'll allow me, I'll give that a consideration, but it's not something I'm persuaded by at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Daniel, followed by Liam MacArthur.
I mean, John Finney's asked, I think, many of the questions I had, but in particular, I mean, I think just a glance at what's being proposed here obviously raises human rights considerations, and while I understand some of the measures such as expressions of opinions of belief regarding prescribed organisations, I can understand the reasons for that. Certainly raises human rights considerations. I recognise that's part of the reserved elements, but as John Finney has rightly pointed out, the biometrics, which is devolved, again raises human rights issues. So can I ask, is the Cabinet Secretary aware of whether the UK Government has carried out a human rights assessment on the bill in its entirety? And has the Scottish Government carried out a human rights assessment on the biometrics element? And if it's not, will it commit to undertaking one?
I can't answer for the UK government, and I'm not aware what process they would have gone above and beyond what they would normally do for pieces of legislation, and perhaps my officials will come in. From my perspective, I'm more than happy to not just speak to human rights organisations, but engage them around where they have particular reservations on the devolved competencies of this bill in particular. So I can commit to absolutely doing that. Again, that being said, you know, I have not had many correspondence, many approaches on this bill from organisations, but I'm happy to kind of ask the question, but I'll kind of see if my officials have anything to add to that.
As far as we're aware, the Home Office did undertake a human rights impact assessment, but it was pretty much their standard bill human rights impact assessment. I understand that the UK Parliament has taken a number of pieces of evidence from human rights agencies, but we haven't had anything directly related to any of the issues that we're considering from any Scottish-based agencies.
Given that the UK government, you understand, has undertaken a human rights assessment, do you not think it would be better for the Scottish Government to proactively look at the elements which will be devolved and do a human rights assessment on those elements if the UK Government has done one for the bill in its entirety? And surely leaving it up to waiting for approaches from human rights organisations is not sufficient. And we only have to look at the issues regarding the rollout of the cyber kiosks by the police to understand the deficiencies in terms of having a full assessment of human rights impact in the criminal justice sphere.
Again, I mean, whenever an issue comes towards me and my officials, question it robustly, and we have conversations around where we might have concerns or not. I'm looking at the three areas that we're asking for an LCM, and I have to say they do not give me huge amounts of concern, because in each of these issues, you know, my previous transport role, I know about ATTROs. You know, I think there's a proportionate response in relation to asking to recoup some of the charge. I think on the biometrics, again, the work that is being done in terms of checks and balances south of the border, but what we're planning to do in relation to introducing legislation on this front, and what I think on legal aid are very, you know, very sensible provisions on legal aid. And in fact, from our perspective, the reason for the LCM is to make sure that there's some level of equity there. They don't give me human rights concerns and raise huge human rights concerns on those devolved competence issues. That is where I am responsible. But I am happy to have a further conversation, with organisations to see if there are concerns. But I don't at the moment have those concerns.
Forgive me, Cabinet Secretary, but I really need to press this point. I mean, I think this goes beyond simply having conversations. I think that the point of human rights assessments is that you do them consistently and you do them every time to ensure that you have got it right. And simply relying on the fact that previous work has been done, either positions created or other elements, is simply not good enough. You have to look at when these questions are raised, and the biometrics element certainly raises them, and do a full human rights assessment to ensure that there are not unintended consequences or things that hadn't been fully considered. And it's certainly not good enough to rely on external organisations to approach, or indeed to rely on your previous work. A specific assessment has to be carried out.
Well, again, I will take that away and reflect on that. As I say, the provisions in the LCM for me are eminently sensible. Moving forward, I'm content with the checks and balances that remain in place, but I also think actually they allow us to bring equity to the system, particularly when I look at legal aid provisions of the LCM. So I don't take away from what Daniel Johnson is saying. I also would say it would be interesting to know the specific concerns on a human rights perspective that he may have on the issues being debated today and around the LCM. But for me, I am content that they are proportionate.
Catherine.
John Finney and Daniel Johnson have laid out very well the concerns I had reading through the papers for this committee. I think we're always conscious, whether it's with statutory instruments, whether it's LCMs, that the scope for getting into the detail of the provisions is more limited. I think I'm at one level reassured that I know colleagues at Westminster will be kicking the tyres and will have been kicking the tyres of this since it was introduced in June. But I think with regard to the devolved aspects, I very much take Daniel Johnson's point that rather than simply awaiting potential concerns being raised, I think the fact that these do appear to be more proportionate is of a reassurance, but shouldn't, I think, preclude the need to undertake proactively those sorts of assessments. I mean, I think a human rights impact assessment is no less fallible than a environmental impact or a business impact assessment. I think what it does, though, help you do is minimise the risk of unintended consequences, and therefore I think would be good practice given the potential far-reaching nature of these sorts of provisions. As you say, I don't dispute the fact that this does appear to be cast in more proportionate terms than some what we've seen previously. but I don't think necessarily we should deviate from an approach that gives us as much reassurance as we can in terms of the devolved.
There's not much for me to add. I think I will reflect on that in terms of best practice. But again, if there are specifics around the devolved competencies that we're asking for legislative consent on, then I'd be keen to hear them from me. I feel they are proportionate, but you know, that doesn't take away from what Liam MacArthur says in relation to perhaps best practice.
What other comments or questions? Do members agree that we give our consent?
Agreed.
No. One, John Finney. You wish to record your dissent?
Convener, I understand that the committee will do a short report on this. If my dissent were noted, I'd be satisfied with that. Thank you.
Okay, we record your dissent. And is the committee happy to delegate the publication of a short factual report to me to work with the clerks to publish and to give you the assurance, John Finney, that your comments will be noted in the report? Yeah.
I think John is clearly wishing to voice a dissent. I think as long as the report captures the substantive points that Daniel was making, that I would certainly echo, that would be helpful.
One way of handling it is the link to the official report. Would that be satisfactory? So the full discussion is there rather than any summary.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. If we're all agreed, then that concludes the item, and thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for attending. Agenda item number 4 is consideration of a proposal by the Scottish Government to consent to the UK Government legislating using the powers under the European Union Withdrawal Act in relation to 3 UK statutory instruments listed on the agenda. I refer members to paper 4, which is note by a clerk, and invite any comments or questions from members. Do we have any? Daniel?
I have one point, which is I was just wondering whether the committee might want to ask the Scottish Government what impact it feels it has, that the fact that there are a number of member states who are not signatories of the Hague Conventions, and in particular I note that Belgium and Ireland are not. And given the volumes of trade that the UK has as a whole, both with Ireland and the Low Countries, and given that this the scope of this is around small claims and evidence for civil actions, I just wondered whether or not that has specific impact.
So you'd like us to ask the question further of the Cabinet, seek further information?
Just further information, indeed.
Are we content to do that? Thank you all for that. Is the committee content then to recommend that the Scottish Parliament gives its consent to the UK Parliament to pass these 3 statutory instruments? Thank you. We'll seek the further information that Daniel Johnson seeks. And are you content that the clerks will produce a short report and for me to be delegated authority to publish this report? Thank you. And that concludes our public part of today's meeting. Our next meeting will be on 20th of November, when we will begin consideration of the Vulnerable Witnesses Criminal Evidence Scotland Bill. We are also set to take further evidence on the Management of Offenders Scotland Bill. And we now move into private session.